You believe you understand forgiveness. You grasp the very essence of mercy. Prepare to have your most fundamental assumptions about justice, debt, and the nature of grace utterly annihilated. Close your eyes, and you are no longer constrained by the sterile confines of modern thought. You are there, ushered into the hushed, cavernous hall of an ancient king, the air thick with the scent of burning incense and the palpable tension of 1,000 silent gazes. Before you, a figure kneels, a man once proud, now reduced to a trembling silhouette against the flickering torchlight, his face etched with unspeakable dread. His fate, and that of his entire lineage, hangs by a thread as thin as human hope. This is not merely a story. It is a meticulously crafted challenge, a disruption of every ancient code of reciprocity and vengeance. Was this a parable merely about human compassion, or was it a cosmic decree, a radical blueprint for a new kingdom where the scales of ancient justice were not merely balanced, but irrevocably shattered? So, as we prepare to uncover these timeless truths, if you find value in this journey, consider leaving a like to support the channel. It makes a huge difference. And as we peel back the layers of this profound mystery, we invite you to share your own insights in the comments below. Now, still your heart and open your mind. The veil of history is about to be torn away. Our revelation begins. You stand among the silent courtiers, your breath caught in your throat as the king's piercing gaze settles upon the shivering servant. The accusation hangs in the air, heavier than any physical burden, a debt of 10,000 talents. The number alone is an affront to reason, an astronomical sum that immediately signals its symbolic weight. To truly grasp the magnitude of this figure, you must strip away all contemporary notions of wealth. A single talent in the ancient world often represented over 15 years of a common laborer's wage, or for a soldier, perhaps 20 years. 1,000 talents could represent the annual revenue of a vast province. 10,000 talents. This was not merely the entire annual tax revenue of a small kingdom like Judea, which paid Rome approximately 600 talents per year. It was a sum so utterly colossal that it bordered on hyperbole, equating to the total national income of a major empire for several years. No servant, no matter how high-ranking, could ever accumulate, let alone repay, such an amount. This was not a debt incurred through mismanaged finances. It was a debt of impossible, unfathomable proportions, perhaps even a metaphor for a life lived in utter defiance of divine command, an accumulation of moral and spiritual liabilities that no finite being could ever hope to settle. It represented a cosmic bankruptcy, a state of being utterly beholden with no pathway out. The king's decree, delivered with the cold, unyielding logic of ancient jurisprudence, falls like a death knell. The servant, his wife, his children, and all that he possessed must be sold to satisfy the debt. You flinch at the casual brutality of the command, yet understand it as the grim reality of a world governed by strict, unforgiving codes of law. Debt slavery was not an abstract concept. It was a pervasive, terrifying institution. Families were broken, generations condemned, their very humanity reduced to chattel to repay what was owed. Archaeological records from Babylon to Rome confirm the devastating impact of such decrees, where an individual's financial collapse meant the dissolution of their identity, their lineage, and their future into the unforgiving maw of perpetual servitude. There was no bankruptcy protection, no fresh start, only the inexorable grinding of the mill of justice until the last farthing was extracted, even if it meant extinguishing a life and all its potential. You watch as the doomed servant, his face contorted in a silent scream, falls prostrate, clutching the king's robes. His plea is desperate, a raw cry for deferment, not for outright cancellation. Have patience with me, and I will repay you everything. You know, as the king knows, as all present know, that this promise is a hollow echo in a vast, empty chamber. He could never repay it. His words are born of despair, not of genuine capacity. And then the impossible happens. The air itself seems to crackle with an unexpected energy as the king, moved by something beyond the calculations of his treasury, beyond the strictures of his own laws, makes a decision that shatters every expectation. He not only grants patience, he goes infinitely further. He is moved with compassion and he releases him. He forgives the entire debt. A debt that would cripple nations, a debt that would enslave countless souls for generations, is wiped clean, utterly erased as if it had never existed. The silence in the hall is thicker now, pregnant with disbelief. Courtiers exchange bewildered glances. This was not justice. This was something far greater, far more radical. It defied the very principle of lex talionis, the eye for an eye that formed the bedrock of ancient law, from Hammurabi's code to the Mosaic covenant. This was not a negotiation, not a partial remission, but an act of pure, unadulterated, and unfathomable grace, a sovereign declaration that overturned the entire economic and social order for this one individual. You can almost feel the weight of the servant's newfound freedom, the sudden lightness in the air where immense despair once resided. One is forced to ask, contemplating such an extraordinary unilateral act of divine-like clemency, how could one comprehend a forgiveness so vast, so utterly disproportionate to any human capacity for repayment? And what did it say about the very nature of the divine economy, where the ledgers of sin required not a meticulous squaring, but a complete, audacious erasure? This king's mercy was not a pragmatic calculation. It was a revolutionary act, a glimpse into a cosmic calculus radically different from anything humanity had ever conceived. The king's decree, an act of grace that defied all precedent, still reverberates in your soul as you watch the freed servant, now light of step and liberated from the crushing weight of his impossible burden, depart the royal court. He walks away, a man reborn, a testament to a compassion so boundless it seemed to emanate from the very heart of the cosmos. The magnitude of his deliverance should, by any measure of human expectation or spiritual transformation, have irrevocably altered the very fabric of his being. You would anticipate, perhaps, a profound humility, an overwhelming sense of gratitude that would compel him to cascade that same improbable mercy upon all whom he encountered. The ancient world, though steeped in the rigid laws of retribution, also understood the concept of noblesse oblige, the idea that immense privilege or blessing carried with it an immense responsibility to act virtuously. Non-canonical texts, such as the Testament of Zebulun, hint at the ideal of mercy begetting mercy, and the Didache, an early Christian writing, famously teaches, "What you wish that no one should do to you, do not you do to another." Yet, what unfolds next is a chilling repudiation of this nascent ideal, a stark portrait of human nature's profound resistance to its own supposed betterment. You follow, invisibly, as the man steps back into the bustling, dust-choked streets of the city. The relief that should have etched itself permanently upon his countenance is disturbingly absent, replaced instead by a grim resolve. It is but a short while before he encounters one of his fellow servants. This man, too, owes him a debt, but the sum is laughably, tragically small in comparison, a mere 100 denarii. To put this into the stark historical context that underscores the first servant's unforgivable blindness, remember that a single denarius represented a day's wage for a common laborer, 100 denarii, while a significant sum for an individual, roughly 3 to 4 months' wages, was an utterly negligible fraction of the 10,000 talents that had just been remitted to him. It was a cosmic dust mote compared to a supergiant star. The disparity is not just economic, it is a profound moral chasm, a chasm that the first servant in his immediate post-forgiveness state seems utterly incapable of bridging. The expectation of reciprocity, so deeply ingrained in ancient societal structures, was not merely a legal principle but a moral obligation. After receiving such an immense gift, the cultural expectation, as detailed in ancient Babylonian and Egyptian legal codes, would have been for the recipient to display an even greater magnanimity, a symbolic mirroring of the higher authority's benevolence. But here, the mirroring is not of grace, but of rigidity. Without a moment's hesitation, without a trace of the compassion he himself had just been shown, the first servant seizes his fellow worker. Your eyes widen in horror as you witness the brutal scene. He chokes him, his hands tightening around the man's throat, his voice a guttural snarl demanding, "Pay back what you owe me." The image is jarring, sickeningly violent, a visceral display of power abused and privilege scorned. This is not the gentle persuasion of a creditor, but the savage assault of a man transformed not by mercy, but by an unreasoning, petty rage, a desire to reassert a dominance he likely felt he had lost in the king's court. The second servant, now in the exact same posture of desperate supplication that his oppressor had been in just moments before, falls to his knees. His plea mirrors, almost verbatim, the very words that had saved the first servant from ruin. "Have patience with me, and I will repay you." The echo is deafening, a direct challenge to the first servant's memory, his conscience, his very soul. Yet the words fall on deaf ears, on a heart now hardened by a bizarre, self-defeating amnesia. The irony is a bitter one, a cruel twist of fate that lays bare the treacherous depths of the human psyche. You observe the first servant's utter refusal to extend the same courtesy that was so freely, so inexplicably bestowed upon him. He throws his fellow servant into prison until the debt should be paid. This was not an act of mere impatience. It was an act of punitive, vindictive cruelty, a deliberate choice to inflict the very suffering from which he had just been liberated. For the common person in the ancient world, imprisonment for debt was often a death sentence, not in the literal sense, but in the sense that it utterly destroyed one's ability to earn, one's social standing, and one's hope of ever repaying the debt. It was a living interment, a slow, agonizing slide into oblivion. This act, more than any other, reveals the insidious corruptibility of the human heart, its astonishing capacity to receive immeasurable grace and yet cling tenaciously to the smallest shred of perceived grievance or entitlement. The other servants, your silent observers in this unfolding tragedy, are deeply distressed by what they have witnessed. Their distress is not merely an emotional reaction, it is a profound moral outrage. They understand, perhaps more keenly than the first servant himself, the colossal breach of ethical conduct, the unforgivable betrayal of the spirit of generosity. In a society where honor and shame dictated so much of public life, such an act would have been a stain, not just on the individual, but on the very concept of justice. For centuries, across cultures and epochs, philosophers and theologians have wrestled with the question of whether true transformation, a genuine change of heart, is an immediate consequence of receiving grace, or if it demands a continuous, conscious effort to embody that grace in one's own action. One is forced to ask, given the radical, almost unbelievable forgiveness shown by the king, how could a heart, so recently liberated from the crushing burden of an impossible debt, so quickly forget the very essence of that liberation and inflict such disproportionate cruelty upon another? Was the freedom merely external, a change in his ledger, or was his internal landscape, his very soul, left untouched, a barren wasteland unable to cultivate the seeds of compassion? The shadow of reciprocity, once broken by the king's radical mercy, now reasserts itself in its most chilling form, threatening to extinguish the very flame of grace it was meant to propagate. The distress of the other servants, witnessing the unfathomable hypocrisy of their colleague, deepens into a profound moral crisis. You feel their collective indignation, their unspoken demand for justice as they make their way back to the royal court. Their report to the king is not merely an act of tattling, it is an appeal to a higher principle, a desperate plea for cosmic balance to be restored. News of such egregious ingratitude, such a brazen betrayal of benevolence, would not remain confined to the marketplace. The king's reputation, his very wisdom and authority, depended on the perception of his justice, tempered by mercy. To allow such an act to stand would be to invite chaos, to undermine the very fabric of social order built on the expectation of appropriate reciprocity, even in its most elevated form. This wasn't just about a debt. It was about the desecration of an extraordinary gift. You are there as the king, his visage now devoid of the previous compassion, summons the first servant. The air crackles with an ominous intensity, far more foreboding than the initial reckoning. This time, there is no trembling supplication from the servant, only a rigid, almost defiant posture, as if he still fails to grasp the true gravity of his transgression. The king's words, when they come, are not a question, but a condemnation, cutting through the silence like a sharpened blade. "You wicked servant! I forgave you all that tremendous debt because you pleaded with me. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant, just as I had on you?" The rhetorical question hangs in the air, weighted with the full force of the king's majesty and his profound disappointment. This is no longer merely about an economic transaction. It has escalated to a moral and spiritual indictment. The ancient codes, particularly those found in the Torah and hinted at in texts like the Book of Jubilees, emphasize the reciprocal nature of divine grace and human action. To accept boundless mercy without extending it to others was not merely a social misstep. It was an affront to the divine order, a rejection of the very nature of forgiveness itself. It was the ultimate act of spiritual blindness, a failure to grasp the transformative power of grace. The king's final judgment is delivered with a chilling finality. He hands the servant over to the jailers, or more accurately, the torturers, until he should pay back all he owed. This is a dramatic escalation, a revelation of the true, terrifying nature of justice when mercy is rejected. To understand the gravity of this, you must dismiss any modern notion of jailers as mere guards. These torturers from the Greek Basanists were not there to merely imprison. They were there to extract payment through agonizing means, to inflict suffering proportionate to the perceived offense or outstanding debt. This was not a system designed for rehabilitation, but for punitive suffering, a stark contrast to the initial boundless mercy. This punishment signifies an enduring, unpayable debt, a state of perpetual torment. It represents a spiritual damnation, not merely a legal one. The very act of the king, who had just offered complete release, now becomes the instrument of agonizing, eternal incarceration. It is a terrifying mirror, reflecting the self-imposed prison of unforgiveness back upon the one who built it. This devastating conclusion forces you to confront the true, radical nature of the parable. It is not merely a moral lesson about being kind to others. It is a profound theological statement about the prerequisites of divine mercy. The kingdom of God, as revealed through this narrative, operates on a principle of received and then transmitted grace. To hoard divine forgiveness, to accept it for oneself but deny it to another, is to fundamentally misunderstand and ultimately to invalidate the initial gift. The lost context here is the profound Jewish concept of midah keneged midah, measure for measure, where divine justice often mirrors human action. While the king's initial act broke this principle with boundless mercy, the servant's subsequent act of unforgiveness reinstated it, bringing down upon him a measure of judgment directly proportional to his own lack of compassion. For centuries, the faithful have wrestled with the question of whether forgiveness from the divine is truly conditional, predicated upon our willingness to forgive others, or if it is an unconditional gift that simply cannot be experienced or retained without extending it. The parable suggests a terrifying answer. The freedom bestowed by grace is not absolute if it is not shared. It is a living river that must flow outward, or else it stagnates and poisons the soul of the recipient. One is forced to ask, given the king's initial, unfathomable compassion, what does it truly mean to pay back an unpayable debt? It is no longer about money. It is about the spiritual currency of the heart. The torturers represent the internal agony and external consequences of a life lived outside the flow of divine grace. The torment is the perpetual weight of unforgiveness, the constant burden of anger, resentment, and bitterness that gnaws at the soul, preventing true peace and connection. It is a self-inflicted spiritual prison, where the very act of withholding mercy becomes the chain that binds the soul. You leave this royal court, not with a sense of simple satisfaction at justice served, but with a profound, almost shattering understanding of the true cost of neglected mercy. The radical forgiveness of the debtor was not merely a challenge to ancient justice. It was and remains a challenge to the very depths of the human heart. It lays bare the brutal truth that the measure with which you forgive others will be the measure with which you are, in turn, measured. The king's final act of judgment is not a retraction of his initial mercy, but a terrible confirmation of its conditionality, a stark warning that the greatest gift can become the greatest curse if it fails to transform the heart into a conduit of the very grace it received. The veil of history falls, but the question remains, echoing through the ages: are you truly free, or are you still bound by the chains of your own unforgiveness? What then is your debt? The echoes of this ancient truth reverberate across time, challenging not only the rigid legalities of the past, but the very foundations of your own understanding of mercy and justice. This parable, deceptively simple, is a profound theological earthquake, shattering millennia of human-centric notions of fairness and reciprocity. It elevates forgiveness from a mere human transaction to a cosmic imperative, revealing that the divine economy operates on principles utterly alien to our earthly ledgers. You are left with the chilling realization that the greatest debt is not what you owe, but what you refuse to forgive. The radical compassion of the king, mirrored by the horrifying self-imprisonment of the unmerciful servant, paints an indelible portrait of humanity's deepest spiritual challenge: to embody the very grace we have so desperately received. This is not simply a story about a king and his servant. It is a timeless revelation of the very heart of the divine, a heart that offers boundless release but demands a reciprocal outflow, knowing that true freedom lies not in the absence of debt, but in the boundless act of letting go.